Magellan attempted to bring under his control was Mactan, ruled at the time by two kings, Sula and Lapu-Lapu. Though we didn't know at the time, Mactan was to be the end of the line for Fernando de Magallanes. Hello, and welcome to the Hispanophiles podcast, Travel in Spain with only half a brain. You know what they say about Spanish history podcasts? They always leave you wanting more. Classic. On today's episode, we are going further than any Castilian has gone before and exploring the world with the first ever circumnavigation around the Earth, courtesy of the fleet led by Fernando Magellan in the 16th century. Spoiler alert, he didn't make it all the way around. Today as well, you can call me Jason Derulo because I am riding solo. That's right, only me in the studio here today. The rest of the Hispanophiles team have the day off, but they better not get used to it because our recording schedule this summer is going to be intense. So make the most of it while you can, guys. We will, however, start with our usual segments, and with regards to Spanish vocabulary, the phrase of the day is "a la tercera va vencida." This is Spain's equivalent to the common English saying, third time lucky. Literally, on the third attempt, she will be beaten, va vencida. It is feminine. It does say she will be beaten on the third attempt, so you'd be forgiven for thinking it was maybe a little bit inappropriate. I'm not entirely sure. Nevertheless, it is a very common phrase and does not, I repeat, does not only refer to the world of courtship and dating. You could say, for example, if you're playing basketball and you've taken two shots that missed, a la tercera va vencida, you're going to get it on the third throw of that ball. Spanish news. And we've got a bit of a tragic one today. Currently recording on the 13th of January 2025. In Thailand, a Spanish national, a 22-year-old woman who was a student of the University of Navarra, has been killed at a sanctuary for elephant care in Thailand, the Koh Yao Elephant Care Centre. Blanca Ojanguren Garcia, apparently was her name, very unusual surname, but I quite like it, was bathing the elephant with her boyfriend when the elephant effectively charged her, pushed her deliberately back. She fell and hit her head and suffered later that day from the brain damages in hospital. Blanca was undertaking an exchange program in Taiwan at the time, and she was visiting Thailand briefly with her boyfriend, who was also present at the incident. The Spanish consulate in Bangkok has assisted Garcia's family in recovering the body and working out exactly what happened. Bit of a brutal way to go, to be honest, and certainly 22, very, very young, very, very unfortunate. However, I will say this, and maybe this is a little bit morbid of me, of all the animals you're going to be killed by, an elephant is not the worst choice. Way better than being beaten to death by a chicken, for example. But hey, maybe too soon. I don't know. I will leave that up to you. With the regular segments done, we will jump straight into the main talking point of the episode, and it's all about that man, Fernando Magellan. In 1519, Magellan led a fleet of 5 ships on a voyage to the Moluccas Islands of modern-day Indonesia that was to go around the entire American landmass and arrive at the archipelago by crossing the Pacific. It is important to understand that the purpose of this expedition was not to discover new lands, nor was it to circumnavigate the Earth for the first time, although this was the serendipitous outcome of the mission. The men of this fleet knew of the places they were travelling to, and many had been there before. And while the crew encountered a lot of surprises along the way, the purpose of this mission was more about acquiring wealth, power, and prestige for Castile than it was about acquiring knowledge. The purpose of this mission explicitly was to make safe and legal passage to the spice-rich islands of the East Indies, nowadays known as the Philippines and Indonesia, to the ultimate benefit of the Kingdom of Castile, who financed the voyage. 2 books I would like to mention were vital in the preparation of this episode. The first one by Roger Crowley, Spice, the 16th century contest that shaped the modern world, and the second one by Edwin Williamson, The Penguin History of Latin America. Both fantastic history books, which we will certainly be referring to in the future as we record more episodes for this podcast. In order to fully understand the story, we need to look at the wider context of the mission first and what was going on in the world that incentivized Magellan and his crew to undertake such a dangerous mission. And we start with a lesson in geography. The Malay Archipelago is a long island chain in Southeast Asia that spans a quarter of the circumference of the Earth from tip to tip, from east to west, comprising the modern states Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and East Timor. Many of these islands sit along the western fault lines of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where ferocious volcanic and seismic activity make this region prone to natural disaster, but also very rich in biodiversity. The geography of the region gave evolution license to go crazy. The thick jungle, deep seas, and nutrient-rich soils incubated many extraordinary plant and animal species in isolation from the rest of the world, and the islands once referred to as the East Indies were a magnet for naturalists in the age of scientific discovery as a consequence of the abundance of extraordinary plant and animal species that could be found there. But going back even further, the peoples of antiquity were well aware of the amazing fruits of some of the more obscure islands of the Malay archipelago. Archaeologists have discovered 4,000-year-old clove buds along the banks of the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Why is this relevant? Because cloves are a plant that is native to only 5 islands in the Malay archipelago, namely Ternate, Tidore, two we will return to later on, Moti, Makian, and Bacan. Another valuable spice that is native to the region is nutmeg, which could only be found on the Banda Islands of modern-day Indonesia. The discovery of clove buds in Occidental Asia tells us 2 things. That the people of the Malay archipelago have long been connected with other civilizations around Eurasia, and that these islanders knew the high value of the fruits and commodities that their islands produced, and that they were happy to capitalize on them. Han Dynasty China used Indian cloves in palace rituals, and Imperial Rome had a thriving marketplace for valuable commodities from remotest Asia. Goods arrived in Rome via the Silk Road, and though the luxurious and elusive Chinese textile silk lends its name to this ancient overland trade network, nutmeg, cloves, and pepper from the Malay archipelago also found their way into Europe across it. Why were humble Asian spices so sought after in ancient times? When dried and crushed, these spices can be applied to meat to help keep it nutritious and mask the smell as it begins to putrefy. At a time when quality nutrition was a rarity and well before refrigeration made it easy for a family to provide their children with 2,000 daily calories, a lightweight commodity that could help keep your children fed and alive was highly coveted. This quality made these spices the valuable commodity they were at the time, and kilos of these goods were stored and sold in the Emporia of the East Indies. Shopkeepers sold them to merchants from Arabia, East Africa, India, China, and Siam, modern-day Thailand. From there, the spices could begin a longer journey to Europe, bulking up their price along the way each time they changed hands with a different merchant going further west. In medieval Europe, a kilo of nutmeg sold for around 1,000 times the selling price in the streets of the Malay archipelago. The wealthy nobility of Europe could only dream of the opulence and grandeur of the Far East, and Marco Polo's Asian Odysseys in the 14th century did much to further stimulate the perceptions that Europeans had of a rich and wealthy Asia. From the 11th century, Genoese and Venetian merchants from what we now call Italy served the European markets as middlemen for Asian goods that arrived there from the Silk Road via Anatolia and the Levant, places we now know as Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. To this day, Genoa and Venice remain cities known for their maritime exploits, and their people have long held competitive advantage on the waves of the Mediterranean and further afield. In 1277, the first Genoese fleet sailed to the British Isles, an event that marked the first maritime connection between the Atlantic and Northern European colonies and the Mediterranean. This voyage also brought the port cities of the Iberian Peninsula closer to the Mediterranean market for Asian commodities. The main currency that Europeans, and in particular the Iberians of Portugal, Castile, Aragon and Navarra, used to buy these goods were gold and human slaves, and the leading source for both of these commodities was Africa. These two goods, of course, would eventually become vital to Imperial Spain's economy a few centuries later. This commercial relationship between the Genoese and the Venetian merchants and the Iberians also fostered the cultural use of precious metals as the basis for a monetary economy in the Iberian Peninsula, and the hunger for silver and gold in particular would become an important stimulus for Spanish and Portuguese foreign policy for centuries to come. But the second half of the 14th century and the start of the 15th century saw depression sweep much of the Iberian Peninsula and southern Europe. Demand for gold outstripped supply. Europeans ended up in a trade deficit to Asia. The Black Death also crippled their populations, reducing the size of the labour market, which in turn reduced agricultural yields, which in turn contributed to further famine and depression across the continent. It was under these conditions that the Portuguese first sought to directly establish a colony in Africa in order to guarantee themselves access to the goods that they desired to facilitate this trade. In 1415, a fleet sailed to the Moroccan coast to capture the port city of Ceuta. The attempt was a failure, but the Portuguese were not put off. Plan B was simply to sail further around the African coast and do the same thing elsewhere. In the 1430s, trading settlements were established in the Canary Islands, in Madeira, in the Azores, and on the African mainland by the Portuguese. Through these trading stations, Portugal, and to a lesser extent Spain, could better guarantee access to precious metals such as gold and slave labour that formed the basis of their commercial relations with powers and merchants in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant. But that was all to change. In 1453, the Muslim Ottoman Empire sacked Constantinople, renaming it Istanbul and cutting off Christian access to the Silk Road almost overnight. Post-Crusades, tensions between Christendom and Dar al-Islam were high in the 15th century, and the Muslim Ottomans mostly refused to trade with the Christian kingdoms of Europe. As European access to Asian spices evaporated, it was Portugal who were in the best position to take advantage of the continent-wide thirst for pepper, cloves, and nutmeg from the Malay archipelago. Having already established footholds along the West African coast, they continued further along the continent, stretching their influence further with every single voyage. The kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula saw each other as brothers, that is to say, relatives but rivals. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 saw the union of two of the largest Iberian kingdoms in a relationship that put what later became Spain on a trajectory to become a global hegemonic power. The conquest of Granada in 1492 finally brought to a conclusion the messy Catholic quote-unquote reconquest of Moorish Iberia, and a zealous, newly confident Spain caught the attention of a certain Genoese navigator who had previously worked and sailed with the Portuguese. Now, this is the moment to say, Christopher Columbus knew the world was round. Magellan knew the world was round. Pretty much all of medieval Europe knew the world was round. The ancient Greeks first worked out that the Earth was curved, and some of them even estimated its circumference to a frightening degree of accuracy. For the record, the circumference of the Earth is just over 40,000 kilometres, or just under 25,000 miles. The notion of sailing west from Europe directly to the Spice Islands of the East Indies in order to leapfrog the Ottoman Empire was no groundbreaking idea, but King John II of Portugal rejected Christopher Columbus's proposal on a cost basis. The Atlantic was a difficult place to sail, and a journey around the world to the Americas was seen as too much of a risk, especially as Portugal was establishing a presence all around the African coast anyway. Columbus's belief that only 2,400 miles separated the Canary Islands and Japan was a distance vastly lower than others estimated it to be, which cost the Genoese navigator credibility in the eyes of the Portuguese nobility and ruling class. However, after having also originally rejected the idea, the ambitious and cunning Isabel of Castile eventually granted Columbus his wish. The Capitulaciones de Santa Fe gave Christopher Columbus the financial backing he needed, as well as the prestigious titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies, and Governor of any land that might be claimed during his voyage. On the 3rd of August, 1492, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria set sail west across the Atlantic to Asia in order to obtain a license from the rulers of Japan and China to establish a private trade in gold and spices under the auspices of his patrons, the Catholic monarchs of Spain. Those are the words of Edwin Williamson in his book that we previously mentioned, The Penguin History of Latin America. The following 14 years saw Columbus make 4 voyages from Spain to the Americas, including the first one, and in 1506 he died still convinced that he had successfully reached Asia. But to other sailors and administrators, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the lands they had discovered, west of Europe and Africa, formed part of a giant continent that Eurasians had previously been unaware of. Spain took a head start in the exploration of what would soon be called the Americas. The earliest map featuring this moniker was published in 1513, with Portugal joining soon after. The duopoly of the New World and of the Atlantic was making Portugal and Castile fantastically powerful, but both monarchies were aware of the potential for conflict. Under the supervision of Pope Alexander VI, a treaty was signed that split the New World between the two polities, 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands owned by Portugal. Portugal would own all yet to be discovered land and held ultimate sovereignty of the seas to the east of this line, and Castile would rule everything west of it. A year later, the Portuguese requested that the line be pushed to 270 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, and the Spanish agreed. Signed in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas split the New World between Portugal and Castile along this line. This is the reason why the most easterly country in all of South America, Brazil, was a Portuguese colony. Most of modern Brazil sits east of this line. It is in this context that we can now turn our attention to Fernando Magellan and his ill-fated circumnavigation of planet Earth. Fernando Magellan was born Fernão de Magalhães, and at this point I must do a shout-out to a colleague of mine with the same surname who explained to me how I pronounce it correctly. So if you're listening, I really hope I've done you proud. Magalhães was a minor Portuguese noble who had served his country dutifully in naval battles and skirmishes around much of the known world, including Morocco, East Africa, Goa in India, Sumatra in Indonesia, the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, and he had also been present at the Portuguese capture of the city of Malacca in 1511. Malacca is a port city on the west coast of the Malay Peninsula with a strategic location on the Straits of Malacca that lie between Sumatra and the peninsula. It was at the time and remains to this day one of the most valuable shipping lanes in the world, and the oldest church in Southeast Asia, St. Paul's, and the Aformosa fortification it overlooks, to which I have been, still stand where the Portuguese built them over 500 years ago. Over the next years, Fernão de Magalhães worked as part of the team that sought to establish Portuguese commercial presence in the Spice Islands, and while the European capture of Malacca disrupted patterns of trade around the archipelago, their reports and findings were invaluable resources on the subjects of the geography, the ecology, economics, and politics of the native peoples of the region. Back in Europe, the Spanish were very aware of the series of incredible successes the Portuguese were enjoying, and they were eager to get their own slice of the pie. The perennial problem was the Treaty of Tordesillas. No one really knew where the anti-meridian line ran on the other side of the earth, and the Spanish at least hoped that some of the Spice Islands might by chance fall into their jurisdiction, defined by that treaty. Nevertheless, the treaty forbade Spanish voyage through Portuguese waters, around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. The only alternative, if the Spanish were to get a foothold in the trade networks of the Spice Islands, was to pick up where Columbus had left off and complete a maritime passage west from the Iberian Peninsula and around Americas to those islands. Feeling like he had been treated unfairly by the Portuguese courts following accusations of selling stolen booty in Morocco in 1514, Fernão de Magalhães had lost his loyalty to the Portuguese crown and was also viewed increasingly unfavourably by his former patrons. A leg injury and a pronounced limp did nothing to dampen his ambitions or spirit of adventure. On the 20th of October, 1517, Magalhães swore an oath of allegiance to Castile in Sevilla, at which point the history books first talk of a man going by the more Castilian-sounding name, Fernando de Magallanes. From this point, we will refer to him by the anglicised version of that surname, Magellan. In January the following year, 1518, Magellan set off to Valladolid, the capital of Spain, where he would meet the 18-year-old Charles Duke of Burgundy, later to be known as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles I. The ministers that Magellan and his co-conspirator Rui de Faleiro, another Portuguese man, a Portuguese astrologer and cosmographer, pitched to the ministers that Magellan and his co-conspirator Rui de Faleiro, a Portuguese astrologer and cosmographer, pitched to the ministers pitched to by Magellan and his co-conspirator Rui de Faleiro, a Portuguese astrologer and cosmographer, were impressed by Magellan's clear bravery and accomplishments, but left wanting by his plan that lacked detail and substance. Much like King Manuel of Portugal, they saw a man blinded by his own convictions and illusions of grandeur, capable in combat, but likely a poor administrator. There was no clear evidence of a passage through the American continent to Asia, and by its very nature, the route outlined by Magellan necessarily had to pass around Brazil and therefore enter Portuguese waters, an act forbidden by the Treaty of Tordesillas. But, in spite of their apprehensions, the ministers passed on Magellan's plan to the youngful King Charles I, who gave it the royal seal of approval on the 22nd of March 1518, less than 5 months after Magellan had become a Castilian citizen. The Castilian crown provided 80% of the startup investment for the voyage, with the remaining 20% up for private equity, the majority of which came from German and Spanish bankers. Magellan and his complice Faleiro were joint captains of the 5-ship fleet called the Armada de Molucca, named after the most famous spice island of them all. But ultimately, the Castilians did not fully trust Magellan. His request for a contractual provision for the personal ownership of 2 spice islands if 6 or more were discovered under his captaincy raised suspicions that his full loyalty did not lie with the Crown of Castile. A Spaniard called Juan de Cartagena was assigned to Magellan and Faleiro as Inspector General, providing a check on their ambitions. Cartagena was not a navigator and had no experience on the water, but he held the authority of deciding who should captain the other 3 ships of the fleet, and also earned a higher salary than Magellan, which irked the former Portuguese captain even more. Shortly before the start of the mission, Cartagena replaced Faleiro, who was sacked on the grounds of mental instability, essentially ridding Magellan of his closest confidant. The Spanish also tried to limit the number of Portuguese-born sailors in the fleet, demanding that the number be capped at 12, but the difficulty of recruiting qualified Castilians meant that in total 37 Portuguese-born men were recruited to be part of the fleet. One exception was the Basque seaman Juan Sebastián Elcano, who shall become very relevant shortly. On the 10th of August 1519, the Armada de Molucca set sail. The 5 ships, including Magellan's flagship the Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and a small scouting vessel, Santiago, sailed down the Guadalquivir River from Sevilla to the small town of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, where they stayed to perform final checks on the boats, as well as ensuring that they had their full 2 years' worth of supplies secured. Sanlúcar de Barrameda lies in the estuary where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic, and nowadays is known for its fantastic sherry bodegas and for being the only place in the world where the dry fortified Manzanilla wine is produced, something I only mention because I'm an enormous fan of it and of the town itself. On the 20th of September, the 5 ships set sail again en route to Tenerife for further maintenance, and on the 3rd of October, the fleet continued from Tenerife into the open Atlantic. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you are, consider giving a like, writing a comment, following, subscribing, giving us a high rating, all that jazz. You don't have to, but it would help us out with the algorithm in the place where you listen to your podcasts. Thank you very much, and let's get back to the episode. It was at this point that tensions began to grow among the crew. Rather than taking a southeasterly trajectory, the Trinidad flagships headed straight south, and Magellan refused to explain his reasoning to Cartagena. Whatever the reason, the crew were met with tough weather which put pressure on supplies, energy, goodwill, motivation, and above all, Magellan's authority. Growing resentment would come to a head at the first meeting of the fleet's leaders on the Trinidad to discuss the matter of the discovery of the captain of the Victoria sodomizing his cabin boy. During this meeting, Magellan grabbed Cartagena by the throat, had him restrained and detained in his flagship's hold. With his co-commander now neutralized, he assigned a sailor loyal to him to captain the San Antonio further. After 3 months at sea, the fleet eventually reached the coast of Brazil, a full 6 weeks behind schedule. The first stop at Cape Santo Agostinho was short, and the ships sailed to Guanabara Bay, where the crew traded manufactured goods with the local Tupi people in exchange for fruit, potatoes, sugarcane, and live fowls. Their interactions with the Iberian sailors were generally positive, but the experiences the Iberians had with the Tupi people would not be representative of their interactions with other native peoples that they would eventually meet. For the next 4 months, the Armada continued down the American coastline, probing inlets and bays to find the elusive strait through the continent. The crew battled against storms, rough seas, damaged rigging, malnutrition, increasingly colder weather, and risk of shipwreck. And the captains of the San Antonio, the Concepcion, and the Victoria, and the Santiago repeatedly requested greater leadership from Magellan, who remained as stubborn as ever. Magellan often refused to give more detail, saying that the Spanish were cowardly for wanting to sail back already. On the 1st of April 1520, Juan de Cartagena and Gaspar de Quesada, the man who was supposed to be in charge of the detained Cartagena, led a mutiny of 30 armed men, taking control of the San Antonio and the Concepcion, with the Victoria following the others in mutiny soon after. Magellan responded with conflict, first taking the Victoria, which contained a greater number of non-Spanish who Magellan knew would be more easily to sway. The Victoria's mutinous captain Luis de Mendoza was stabbed by armed men sent to deliver a message from Magellan. The crew surrendered without further bloodshed, and control over the Victoria was restored immediately. With control of the Santiago, the Victoria, and of course the Trinidad, Magellan firmly outnumbered and outgunned Cartagena and Quesada aboard the San Antonio and the Concepcion. These 3 ships cut off the mutinous 2 from open water inside a bay, making escape possible without sailing close to Magellan's ships. The San Antonio attempted exactly this. They tried to sail by the Trinidad only for the flagship to open fire directly on the San Antonio. Armed men came aboard, and Quesada and his allies were arrested. Cartagena and the Concepcion capitulated, and within 24 hours Magellan had defeated the mutiny. Former captain of the Victoria, Mendoza, was hung, drawn, quartered, and impaled on poles as a message for all would-be mutineers thereafter. The servant of Quesada, Luis del Molino, was manipulated into murdering his master. Bits of Quesada joined Mendoza on the spikes, and 42 other mutineers were either tortured or executed, which took an enormous toll on the expedition. Juan de Cartagena, meanwhile, was marooned on an island, with priest Pedro Sanchez de Reina left to die by the rest of the crew. With winter approaching and morale low, the fleet was due to remain in St. Julian's Bay for a total of 5 months. The smaller Santiago was dispatched to make a reconnaissance tour south along the coast in an attempt to find the elusive strait through the continent, but it was shipwrecked 70 miles from where the fleet were moored. 2 men sailed on planks of wood across the water and then trekked across frozen land back to St. Julian's Bay, where they were picked up 11 days later, almost starved to death. A rescue party was then sent to pick up the remainder of the shipwrecked crew. On the 24th of August, the remaining 4 ships set sail once again. On the 21st of October, the fleet entered a bay of very deep water. The Concepcion and the San Antonio were sent forward to explore, while a strong storm buffed the Trinidad and the Victoria further out into sea. The ships were separated for 3 days before cannon fire performed by the Concepcion and the San Antonio communicated good news. The 2 ships had found a second bay that gave all signs of the possibility for continued passage further ahead. The 4 ships proceeded to explore the maze of channels, inlets, bays, capes, and islands with geography like nothing any of the sailors had ever seen before. They could find no human activity in the wilderness they saw, but instead blue glaciers, powerful waterfalls, and big snowy peaks. Frequent fog and unrelenting winds constantly terrified and tired the crew. Distant fires were initially believed to be evidence of human activity, but the crew found no locals wherever they went. The fires were most likely a consequence of a lightning strike, and gave this place the name it holds today, Tierra del Fuego. The crew were extremely studious, mapping out the coastline as they explored it with incredible detail and crossing off each dead-end cul-de-sac they encountered. Eventually, on the 1st of November, the Trinidad and the Victoria took a right turn into a narrow channel marked by tides, currents, and a constantly high salinity of the water beneath them. passage to the other side of the continent and open water beyond could be inferred from these qualities. But Magellan called for counsel with the captains of the ships to inquire as to what their next move should be. One Portuguese sailor of the San Antonio, Estevão Gomes, cautioned against onward journey, but was overruled by a belligerent Magellan. Then, days later, the San Antonio vanished after having been sent out for another reconnaissance mission. The 3 remaining ships spent days looking for the vessel, or looking for a potential wreck which could explain the absence. But they were unaware that Gomes had already attacked the captain of the San Antonio, commandeered the vessel for himself, and had set sail for Seville, where the crew would be imprisoned and interrogated upon arrival. The San Antonio was the largest ship of the fleet and held the bulk of the supplies for the mission. Thus, its absence was a disaster. The crew had been decimated, and morale was at its lowest point yet. But constant manipulation and mind games played by Magellan put the experience of retribution for mutiny firmly back in the crew's minds, and written endorsement of his plan to continue the mission was submitted. On the 28th of November, 1520, 36 days after having entered the network of waterways of Tierra del Fuego and the southern tip of Patagonia, the Trinidad, the Victoria, and the Concepcion had finally reached the other side of the American continent. The large strait they passed through now bears Magellan's name on all maps. The remaining crew members celebrated the achievement, vastly underestimating the size of the ocean that they had reached and how long it would take to get to the Moluccas Islands. On December 17th, the 3 remaining boats ventured into open water, and within a day, landmass could no longer be seen. The fleet sailed parallel to the American landmass, first in a northerly direction before adjusting slightly in a northwest direction. The weather conditions they faced could not have been more different to those that they had endured over the long winter. Days passed without any crew member having to adjust a single thing on the ships. The rigging, the sails, everything could be left alone in these gentle waters that simply pushed the boats further at a remarkable speed. The gentle nature of the weather they encountered inspired the name for which the ocean henceforth would be known, the Pacific. Unfortunately, subsequent European navigators and sailors would be tricked into thinking that they could enjoy such easy sailing in this monster of an ocean. But while the weather may have been kind, fatigue was starting to take its toll on the health of these sailors, in particular where diet is concerned. The resources that remained were poor, and the men's health suffered, with multiple sailors eventually succumbing to an odd illness whereby their gums would swell painfully. Unable to chew or eat anything else, the sailors who developed these symptoms would die soon after. But bizarrely, the officers on board these ships were not affected by this mysterious illness. This was scurvy, taking its toll on the bodies of the sailors who were starved of vitamin C, and it is believed that the quince jelly that had been reserved for the commanders of the voyage helped Magellan and others fight scurvy. Initial sightings of land disappointed, as the ships passed a small number of resourceless atolls in the middle of the Pacific. But eventually, on the 6th of March, land was spotted. Atop the ship's mast, one sailor spotted 2 islands close together with green hills, coconut trees, and, most promisingly, thatched huts, a definitive sign of civilization. After 3 months of cabin fever and illness on the world's greatest ocean, had Magellan and his men finally arrived at the Spice Islands? No, or at least not quite. They had reached the island of Guam in the Mariana Island chain, what is now a territory of the United States of America. The 3 ships dropped anchor in a suitable bay, and multiple vessels of the local Chamorro people came out to the boats. But from the start, these people proved hostile to the Europeans. Men climbed aboard the ships and went on a rampage, looting manufactured goods and robbing from the exhausted sailors at will. Artillery fire was used to subdue the locals, and the following day a furious Magellan led a small team to the island to seek revenge. Once ashore, they burned a village, butchered locals, stole any food they could find, and retook a small boat that the islanders had taken the day before. The 3 ships quickly departed. On the 16th of that month, they again saw land. The Iberians had reached the island of Samar in what is now the Philippines. At long last, they had reached the islands of Southeast Asia, albeit without knowing how close they were to the coveted Spice Islands, or whether or not they had inadvertently ventured into the jurisdiction of the Portuguese, who may well have been close by. With the difficult part of the job completed, and buoyed by a newfound motivation, Magellan and his men were eager to establish positive relationships with the people they encountered. But first, they had to rest. The crew ventured onto the small island of Homonhon. Here they found fresh water, which they drank and bathed in, and they killed and roasted a pig that had been acquired on Guam to eat. On the 18th, a small local boat with 9 men approached. Magellan ordered his men to remain calm and docile, so as not to trigger a flashpoint, but the locals who met them were hospitable. Relieved, Magellan gifted the locals with some manufactured goods such as bells and mirrors, and the locals indicated that they would return shortly with food for the malnourished Europeans. The following days saw very cordial relations between the locals and the visitors, and it became very clear to Magellan and to the commanders of the Armada that these people were accustomed to visitors, a hugely encouraging sign. The Europeans remained in the company of these natives in Homonhon for a week before proceeding deeper into the archipelago. On the 28th of March, the crew encountered a vessel manned by Malay speakers whom Magellan's servant Enrique was able to converse with and gather knowledge from. This was concrete evidence of their arrival in the Malay archipelago where Magellan had served the Portuguese crown all those years ago. The 3 ships stopped on the island of Limasawa, where Magellan befriended Raja Kolambu. Impressed by the European technology and in awe of the might of the visitors' weaponry, Kolambu welcomed Magellan ashore, and Easter was celebrated in the company of locals, where a giant cross was erected on the hillside. Though this was explained to the locals as a way to protect their island, in reality it was probably the first attempt by Magellan to secure one of the 6 islands he needed for Castile in order to claim 2 for himself, with Cartagena now firmly out of the picture. Magellan asked King Kolambu if he had any local enemies that he could help vanquish. Kolambu's initial response was evasive, brushing away the question by explaining that now was not the opportune moment. But it seems, by this question, Magellan's ambition and further were growing, bolstered perhaps by the positive reception they were enjoying in Limasawa. Kolambu journeyed with the Europeans, and on the 7th of April they reached the island of Cebu, where the ruling king Humabon welcomed the visitors, but explained that it was customary to pay tribute when arriving in his port. Magellan flatly refused, snubbing Humabon, but luckily a Siamese sailor present who had experience working with the Portuguese in Malacca quickly explained to the king how dangerous these pale-faced visitors could be. Humabon reconsidered, waived the payment, and supplied Magellan and his men with a decent amount of food. This further fed Magellan's growing sense of infallibility in these islands, and he claimed Cebu as a Spanish colony and personally baptized Humabon as Charles on the 14th of April. The next island that Magellan attempted to bring under his control was Mactan, ruled at the time by 2 kings, Sula and Lapu-Lapu. Though we didn't know at the time, Mactan was to be the end of the line for Fernando de Magallanes. King Sula sent tribute to Magellan on the 26th of April, but Lapu-Lapu did not understand why he should be expected to send tribute to this foreigner and refuse. Magellan saw red. Refusing offers of support from his ally Humabon, Magellan prepared an attack on the small island, believing the ferocious might of the Spanish and Portuguese forces would be more than a match for the local islanders. At dawn, 49 men jumped into the water at low tide and waded through half a mile of reefs surrounding the islands in full armour. The low tide prevented the ships getting any closer, and the slow walk through the water only served to weigh the sailors down and exhaust them. Eventually, the 49 men took on and alleged 1,500 of Lapu-Lapu's men, according to Spanish accounts. Needless to say, it was a massacre, and the Spanish and Portuguese men paid dearly for their captain's bravado and overconfidence. Stones, bamboo spears, balls of mud, and arrows pierced the flesh and crushed the bones of the European invaders. After half an hour, some of the Europeans began to abandon the mission and started to wade back to the boats they had come from, but Magellan was caught by the locals and killed. Requests for his body to be delivered to the ships were ignored by King Lapu-Lapu. Humabon had watched the disastrous battle unfold from a boat moored in the low waters. Though initially distraught at the death of his ally Magellan, he quickly understood that the Europeans were not invincible, and furthermore his status as an ally of theirs put him at risk of retaliation from Lapu-Lapu's forces. He invited many of the Spanish and Portuguese sailors back to Cebu, allegedly for a feast. 30 took the offer, but when they arrived, many were captured and killed. The crew now stood at only 110 men from the 235 that Magellan was originally granted. With so few men remaining, the crew decided to abandon the suffering Concepcion, and everything of value was transferred to the Victoria, now captained by Basque Juan Sebastian Elcano, and the Trinidad captained by Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa. The Concepcion, riddled with worms and at the end of its life, was set alight in the water and left to burn. The two final boats spent 6 months navigating the islands of the East Indies until finally, with the guidance of an abducted local with knowledge of the seas, on the 6th of November, 1521, they finally reached the volcanic spice islands Ternate and Tidore of the Moluccas. On the 8th, they docked at the port of Tidore and discovered to their delight that they had arrived at a time when no Portuguese vessels were present. The King Raya Sultan Mansur greeted them graciously and exchanged gifts. Having expected some degree of hostility, it quickly became apparent why Mansur was so warm to the Spanish. The Portuguese-backed king of the opposing island Ternate was his bitter rival, and the presence of the Spanish artillery offered greater protection. The Spanish ships filled with the cloves they had come for, and eventually prepared for departure before the Portuguese could return. But damage to the Trinidad obligated a longer stay for repair. With Elcano at the helm, on the 1st of December 1521, the Victoria set sail with 60 men on board, leaving its sister behind at the port. Elcano decided to take a risk by knowingly sailing west through Portuguese waters and around Africa in order to get back to Europe, but he astutely mitigated some of the risk by reducing the weight of the cargo of cloves on the ship. The Trinidad would finally leave Tidore on the 6th of April 1522 and chose the alternative route, instead sailing back across the Pacific and around the Americas from where it had come. A disastrous voyage under the inexperienced Espinosa saw them eventually return back to the Moluccas, where the recently arrived Portuguese boarded the ship to find only 20 men still alive. The Trinidad was stripped of all of its assets and then smashed to pieces by a tropical storm as all 20 men were captured. Against all odds, the Victoria, led by Elcano, outmaneuvered the Portuguese ships scattered around the Indian Ocean, who by this time were aware of what had been going on. The Spanish deliberately forsaked an obvious stop-off at Madagascar and completed a huge arc through the Indian Ocean directly to the Cape of Good Hope. On the 7th of July, they crossed the equator and stopped in the Cape Verde Islands to restock on food, lying to the Portuguese stationed there by telling them that they were a Spanish ship that had been blown off course from the Americas by bad weather. But the sight of a hold full of cloves from the Spice Islands raised suspicions. As some Castilians were arrested, the remaining Spaniards quickly cast off again in the Victoria and continued their hasty journey north. On the 6th of September 1522, a full 1,123 days after they had originally set sail, the Victoria arrived at Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Only 18 men were still alive on the boat, but against those crazy odds, the Armada de Molucca had achieved what it had set out to do. On the 8th, the Victoria dropped anchor in the Triana district of Sevilla, and the next day the survivors of the hellish voyage immediately completed their pilgrimage to the church of the Santa Maria de la Victoria to fulfill their vows they had made when a storm struck them off the coast of Brazil. Their survival in the face of such adversity was seen as nothing short of a blessing from God. Even though the Victoria's haul of cloves barely covered the initial investment in the Armada, Juan Sebastian Elcano became an immediate celebrity and to this day remains a key figure in Spain's narrative of its own history. Certainly, the Castilians were pleased that it was a Spaniard leading home the Victoria and not one of the Portuguese, who they had mistrusted right at the beginning of the voyage. Rather than being seen as a cruel and avaricious agent of Imperial Spain's destructive expansion in the Americas, Elcano is seen as a pioneer of global exploration and the first man who successfully circumnavigated the Earth, even if it was Magellan and Ruy de Faleiro who first pitched the idea to the Castilian ministers in 1518. Later that month, he met the king in Valladolid and showed him some of the exotic birds and animals that they had transported back from the East Indies. Elcano was granted an official coat of arms, which bears cinnamon sticks, cloves, and nutmeg, and features the motto, Primus circumdediste me, you were the first to circumnavigate me. And with that, we conclude the story of the first ever circumnavigation of the world Now, I really, really hope you enjoyed that. For me, one of the things I love about Spain so much is the incredible richness of its history, a lot of which is not particularly happy, but it is important nevertheless. And one of the things I would like to do in this podcast is explore Iberian history as much as I can. We will be doing more history-rich topics, while also doing some of the more fun, lighty, chatty stuff as well. Whatever topic you would like to learn more about in Spanish history, please feel free to write in, give a comment, and we will look into researching it and hopefully bring an episode to you soon. All that remains is for me to thank you for listening to Hispanophiles podcast, and I hope to see you once again soon. Have a fantastic day. Goodbye.